I call this Words with Life. Recently I had a chance to sit around in a doctor's waiting room for a while, and I had some thoughts about reading in general, and I'm going to share them with you here. I don't have to point out to you something that I pointed out in this blog a number of times before, that reading and language in general obviously depends on the sense it makes. And making sense is, well, sensual. It involves the senses. Essentially, all writing and language is a reference to the sense world and to physically experiencing something. It's like a call to action. If we're all standing around the swimming pool of life, so to speak, considering going in for a dip, since language is all about the sense that it makes, language can but suggest that we do or don't, take the plunge, enter the world of physical experience and gather some experience, if only to have something to feel, to analyze, and to know, and to remember. Anyway, what we read out there in the written world is obviously geared for different levels. Sitting around the doctor's office in a hospital in a city far from home, I had, little else to do but think. And what I thought was that I have become more and more sensitive to the written or the spoken word, for example. It's clear that much, maybe even most writing is designed to help us conceptually understand what the author's trying to say. Of course, simple understanding, abstract understanding, is the bottom line. And in my opinion, it's the lowest rung of the totem pole. And it's pretty much stripped of why I read at all, which is to break out of conceptuality. So anyway, I've become a critic of reading for understanding alone. Unless I'm, following directions or putting together some shelf or do-it-yourself thing or other. These years I find conceptual writing kind of suffocating, kind of prophylactically buffering so that anything more than concepts are duly avoided. This conceptuality kind of squeezes the sense out of language. And in this category would be what I call meta books, overviews, books about a subject rather than books comprising a subject, if that makes sense. The endless books filled with quotes and footnotes that use other people's words as references to describe something that the author is unable or unwilling to try to say personally. That's what I'm talking about here. These kind of books run all around the subject but never touch it. In my opinion, I never read them. I yearn for authority, for authenticity, and so on. I want language to dispense with itself as much as possible, get itself out of the way, to be transparent. I want any reading I do to give me a taste and hopefully cause me, to want to get my feet wet, if not actually plunge me into something, an experience that I can later reflect on and then analyze or conceptualize. Writing that just conceptualizes for me about almost nothing, with no real sense involved, it's just not my cup of tea. As you might imagine, I'm particularly sensitive to books on Buddhism or spiritual topics of any kind. I don't want to just stand back and hear about something. I want to jump in. I want to experience something. I want to sense it, feel it. Give me a taste of what you're talking about. Give me something to go on, please. I don't like language that is just conceptually recursive, building an ever and ever greater dependence on itself. Of course, I write a lot, and I post it here, and I do introduce concepts, but I work very hard to load my sentences with words that work, to pop the conceptual bubbles that are inescapable, and I try to give you a real feeling for the topic. No, I don't push you into the water, so to speak, but I may splash some water on you, or at least near you. This little poem I wrote, I've shared here before, but this is where it belongs. So here it is again. It's called Verbal Fallout. The half-life of words is brief. Prose is like carrying water in the hands. Poetry like drinking from the faucet. Now, I can't seem to just write poetry. I wish that I could. At will. I'd love to just be a poet. What you get from me is prose, and didactic prose at that. But hopefully prose that is laced with words that are juicy enough to give you, at the very least, a sample, a taste of what I'm writing about. In my own reading habits, at least these years, I seldom to never read fiction. I've read tons and tons of fiction in the past. And unless I need to learn something very basic, I avoid reading books that are primarily conceptual. Just somehow they're too claustrophobic for me. I find them cloying. What I do read are some of the traditional Buddhist writings that are called Upadesha. These are the pith writings of great teachers. They're not poetry, but they can be, but rather they are the pith essence of the Dharma boiled down to the equivalent size of poetry, but not quite poetry itself. And why I read this so eagerly is for the compactness of somehow managing to mix enough poetry with the prose to fire my synapses and spark my mind. I always want to get beyond conceptuality. I want to get into the experience of life itself. So these Upadesha often or usually do just that. They're like jumping off points into my experience of the spirit itself. If only as seen through the lens of these jam-packed sentences, these very concise teachings which are called Upadesha, I have no illusions as to what language is there for. Being itself, by definition, conceptually contrived. Getting language not to point at itself, or even barely beyond itself, but somehow lead us beyond words into some form of action is what I intend. Language is not the final word, so to speak, but rather the jumping off point into experience itself. At its very best, words and language can act as a sign or a signal that is enough to cause a transformation within me without reading further. Anyway, that's how I see it.